So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Carceral Temporalities and the Politics of Dreaming, a keynote by Jackie Wang, which will be moderated by Snodgrass. And this is the first keynote event of this year's Transmediale. Because we're running a little bit late, I'm skipping to a bit of my contextualization, and I think Eric will do a very good job on that anyway. I just want to quote actually from the text about our study circle, Effective Infrastructures, that have a session tomorrow. And I quote, "How can the lived experiences of material and effective infrastructures be used to mobilize bodies, energize politics, and bring about change?" I think such questions also underpin the keynote and discussion that we're going to have here today, especially since it looks at ways of countering oppressive temporal regimes and racial politics within technical and institutional infrastructures. And as such, this event corresponds also to something we wrote in this year's thematic text, which ended with the line that we're interested in a renewal of the practice of countercultural dreaming. And to further introduce tonight's speaker and contextualize this topic a bit more, we've invited the media researcher Erik Snodgrass. Erik is a senior lecturer at the Department of Design at Linnaeus University, Sweden. His research looks into the intersections of media, politics, and technology, with a focus of issues of materiality, infrastructures of power, and forms of intervention. Here at Transmediale, actually you might know him from some previous activities. There was a panel last year on affect, actually, also on the issue of counting lives. I'm quite inspired, and we are in the festival team, by his recent work on execution in relation to power in networked and computational media. And I think this dissertation proposes something of a paradigm shift in critical software and media studies, and gives it a decidedly more political sense of urgency, while at the same time not abandoning the study of material conditions. And I'm very happy now to welcome Erik to further introduce Jackie. Please, welcome.
Hi. I've been asked to do an introduction to Jackie Wang's really inspiring book tonight. We're going to be talking a lot about time, and we're already talking about time pressures. But of course, I want to do the traditional thing up here is just to really, really thank everyone involved with Transmediale, Christopher, Daphne, and especially all the members of the team who make this happen year after year. I know that they introduced the study circles this year with the younger upcoming students, which I imagine was even more work to do, and I've heard it's been really, really great. So thank you to all of Transmediale. The title of Jackie Wang's talk tonight is Carceral Temporalities and the Politics of Dreaming. Before handing the stage over to Wang, I just want to say a few words about how we might consider the topics of this keynote in the context of this festival, its themes and its approaches. Carceral, for those not familiar with the English term, stands for anything pertaining to imprisonment or a prison. Wiktionary.com tells me its Proto-Indo-European root, scare, signifies an intention to bend or turn in the sense of an enclosure. For those who've had the chance to read Wang's work, this sense of bending and enclosing clearly matters, both in the sense of enclosing bodies and people within physical enclosures, such as supermax prisons or solitary confinement cells, court or parole waiting rooms, but also in the phenomenological or temporal sense of having rigid and, it has to be said, very brutal timescales of things like long-term imprisonment, but also, as Wang writes, cycles of debt imposed upon one in a way that bends and remakes the rhythms of an individual and whole communities' day-to-day lives. This is a festival that has long focused on issues of technology, and in moving towards a consideration of carceral temporalities tonight, we might begin by reminding ourselves of the many kinds of socio-technical machine rhythms that contemporary technologies charge the present with. Whether one is talking of the restless updates of infinitely scrollable social media streams, a fast or slow internet connection, a TikTok mobile video that, quote, makes every second count, or the accelerated and coordinated microtemporalities and executions of machine time. In Wang's book, we are given a few further examples of the tight weaving of time and technology, such as that of predictive policing algorithms, which he speaks about, that direct the patrols of police beats to particular areas and particular bodies more than others, as one sees in the case of routine and continuous cycles of stopping, searching, and often fining, with the police officer's typical daily work life here acting as an oppressive but perhaps rhythmic counterpoint to those subjected to those ongoing stops, searches, fines, and intrusions into their day-to-day lives. These are structures of capitalist rhythms that include in their life-bending flows now long and established histories of racism, violence, and a continuous robbing of people's possibilities and time through the sustained and aggressive imposing of these structures and temporalities on multiple, and in the last few decades, expanding segments of communities and populations. This is, as Wang says, a weaponization of time that is distributed and enacted across different scales of the physical, the temporal, the economic, the mental, the social, and onwards. In opposition to this, Wang's new book, Carceral Capitalism, builds on existing scholarship and activist histories of the past and present. It does so by giving a clear outline of the political economies involved in mass incarceration, showing in really accessible and strong examples how in the United States these structures and processes continue to be imposed across an increasing number of actors. From the Black and minority communities, often most thoroughly affected, to the working class in general, and further on to young people from all segments of society who are also being trapped into predatory cycles of death, and onwards into government municipalities and their own crises of infrastructure and imagination. In mapping and outlining how these two structures of oppression work, Wang gives further sharpened and ready tools for us to approach a set of battlegrounds into which contemporary political action can insert itself. We know how these structures and processes work, and so, therefore, they can be changed. Just finally, in the context of the US prison problem and the kind of artistic and politically oriented work we see presented at Transmediale, there have been a few examples from the past in this particular area, such as some might know of Columbia University's Interdisciplinary Spatial Design Lab and their work on the $1 Million Blocks project in 2006. Other examples include the successful campaign to close down the Thames Supermax prison in Illinois, which included amongst its coalition of members artists as well as the voices and artistic visions of the prisoners themselves. We see similarly hopeful kinds of constellations today in Europe, America, and elsewhere, including those examples such as forensic architecture, Watch the Med, Black Lives Matter, and beyond. For those who haven't encountered it, I would also point out how in Wang's work we see an artistic and political craft of writing at play. The book is full of lovely passages of writing and feeling, showing Wang's background as a poet, a blogger, a zine maker, and someone who wants to give issues, these particular issues, a living voice. Finally, there is also the collective tone that Wang establishes in the book in its clear aligning of its own call to action with the dreams and historical practices and voices of those involved at the front line of earlier revolutionary struggle, including the Black Panthers, Assata Shakur, Rosa Luxemburg, poets from different countries, and also lesser-known voices that Wang works to bring to life, coalitions of voices and actors who never shied away from the hard work of materializing seemingly impossible dreams through sustained forms of action over time. Okay, and just a quick bio from the back of the book, and I'll pass over to our speaker, Jackie Wang. As her profile so nicely puts it, Jackie Wang is a student of the dream state. She's a Black Studies scholar, a prison abolitionist, a poet, a performer, a library rat, a trauma monster, a player of the harp, a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and African American Studies. She's the author of a number of punk zines, including On Being Hard Femme, and her most recent book, Carceral Capitalism, is published with Semiotext in the Semiotext Intervention series. And so, over to Jackie Wang.
thank you so much, Eric, for that really thoughtful introduction. You actually anticipated my prelude to my talk, which is kind of funny. But I'll review what you just said. But I wanted to thank Transmediale and all of the organizers, particularly Daphne and Anna, for reining me in and sending me emails and keeping me on top of everything. Thank you. And I've actually been going to the many of the events at the festival so far, and it's been mind expanding. I'm just absorbing so much information, so it's a huge honor to be here with you tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about carceral temporalities. So I'm thinking specifically about the prison as an institution that structures time. And this topic was something that I began to think about when I was writing my book, Carceral Capitalism, which I believe is for sale in the bookstore. While I was writing this book, I was trying to finish the introduction and figure out a way of stitching these disparate essays together. And as I was in the final stages, my older brother, who had a juvenile life without parole prison sentence, which you do not have here in Germany, I believe, he had a resentencing hearing because the laws in the US had changed such that mandatory juvenile life without parole was considered unconstitutional, but discretionary is still allowed. And so while I was at the hearing, there was something very surreal about the whole scenario because I had testified before the same judge many years ago, so I'm 31 now. This hearing was 2 years ago, and my brother was 17 when he went to prison. I was 16. And I was thinking about how our lives had diverged in the years since he had been locked up, and specifically, I was thinking about where I'm at in my life now, but also the different tempos that we occupy. So when my brother got locked up, he didn't use email. And I remember in a letter that he wrote to me, he asked me if it costs money to send emails. And this was right when smartphones were widely used, and it was very surreal to me that his conception of time, the speed of his communication was radically different from mine. So his primary method of communication until around a year ago was through letters and occasional 15-minute phone calls, whereas I could communicate with anyone around the world basically instantaneously. And so I started to think about time and both the way in which prison structures time by controlling the regimentation of time. So it's very rigid how it functions inside prison. There's a specific time that you wake up and you go to sleep, and there's allocated recreation time and meal times. But I also began to think about other carceral temporalities, such as the temporality of debt. So what does it mean to be ensnared in a bond that basically enables the creditor to own the debtor's future? This is something that people in the US live with in a very intense way because of the burden of student debt, for example. And how does what you can do in the present relate to these, more nebulous controls on our time and ownership of our future? Because this is something that is kind of in the backdrop, but really structures the decisions that we make, what we think is possible, what we can imagine. And then I also think about how smart devices structure the rhythm of our lives through a system of intermittent rewards. in the form of push notifications, likes, and digital engagement. So what hold do these biochemical disbursements have over our lives? And so even when I think about what is politically possible in any moment, there's a very real way in which the kind of register of consciousness that we're existing on is in some way structured by these rhythms. And smart devices really are about creating a rhythm of intermittent rewards. And I also am thinking of the temporality of predictive policing, which conjures hostile futures to justify the management of the present. And after I kind of talk about all of these depressing ways in which time is structured and managed and how the management of time forecloses possibilities, I want to kind of end with a meditation on strategies to resist the imposition of those carceral temporalities. So I end this talk with a meditation on the rhythm of revolt. And so it's funny because I get a lot of people asking me about my relationship to language because I'm a poet and I end my book with poetry. But I really want to emphasize the rhythmic element to politics and what the creation of collective rhythms can make possible politically. And Sun Ra is a philosopher and jazz musician who I've found immense inspiration from on this point in particular. And I also end with a meditation on revolutionary prophecy, which is the act of creating an opening in time by projecting yourself into the future in order to manifest the latent possibilities embedded in all duration. So I really want to think of prophecy not necessarily as predictive power, but as seeing the openings in the present through imagining futures. So this talk is titled Carceral Temporalities and the Politics of Dreaming. Tonight, I hope to offer an analysis of carceral power that focuses on the axis of time and the weaponization of time as an instrument of social control. When comparing the southern US convict lease system to contemporary mass incarceration, historian Alex Lichtenstein writes that prison life in the late 19th century and early 20th century was characterized by hard labor, while modern prison life is best described as hard time. While the use of temporal punishment may appear to be more humane than physical punishment, this regime of control is just as cruel insofar as it is a total attack on the subjectivity and psyche of the prisoner. Furthermore, the supplanting of a corporeal regime of punishment with a temporal one enables prisons to maintain their moral legitimacy because the damage done by temporal punishment is not legible in our current framework for understanding harm and pain. This is partly due to the fact that no visible wound is left on the body of the prisoner when time is used as an instrument of torture. Pain is usually defined as physical pain, even though emotional, social, and psychic pain share the same neural circuitry as bodily pain. 1. Solitary confinement as detemporalization. Solitary confinement as a punitive carceral practice has its roots in a late 18th century penal ideology first developed by Quakers in the US. And this ideology eventually became known as the Pennsylvania system, I have an example here of Eastern State Penitentiary. So this was a prison that was opened in 1829. And this architectural design is called the radial model. So it was very expensive to produce these prisons, and it actually ended up driving people crazy. So it wasn't very popular in the United States, but it was exported around the world. So as you can see, it shares some overlap with Bentham's panopticon design. So in the center, there's a watchtower, and spokes radiate out from the center. And alongside the spokes, there are individual cells. So every prisoner is held in an isolated cell, and they're not allowed to, or they weren't allowed to interact with other prisoners. This prison has been decommissioned, and now you can go on tours and see it. But on the top of every cell was a skylight that was supposed to represent the eye of God. So the idea was that if you were in isolation and forced to do nothing, you would just be, beamed with light, and you would internalize that feeling of being watched, and you would repent and realize that you had done wrong. But this design and this method of solitary confinement ended up driving people crazy. So that's part of the reason why it was kind of abandoned early on. But even though these experiments were considered a failure, solitary confinement was revived beginning in the 1970s with the rise of supermax prisons and the creation of control units and security housing units, or SHUs. Black, Native, and Puerto Rican militants, as well as white leftists, have argued that the revival of solitary confinement practices was tied to the deliberate weaponization of isolation as an attempt to psychically break and punish political prisoners through a process that aimed to dismantle their personalities and worldviews. So this is something that happened in the US. It still happens. In the US, there's indefinite solitary confinement in some places, even though the US claims to not use solitary confinement. But many of these militants who were writing in the 70s and 80s actually said that this strategy came from West Germany. So the notorious Stammheim prison, which was used to hold the Red Army faction, they developed this strategy called dead wings, basically, where they would hold political prisoners in completely isolated wings devoid of any people. So although this carceral practice was initially used on political prisoners, it has become a normalized feature in the US, even though the US claims to not use solitary confinement. Solitary confinement may appear to be a practice primarily aimed at the spatial regulation of prisoners. However, it is inextricably tied to the axis of time. While solitary confinement denies prisoners access to all embodied modes of relationality by physically removing prisoners from their social context, it also aims to distort the prisoner's perception of time and undermines their sense of time altogether. Solitary confinement robs people of their temporal agency by imposing a rigid carceral time that is punctuated by meals, shower time, and, if allowed at all, recreation time. In written accounts of solitary confinement, prisoners frequently write about losing all sense of time, hallucinating, losing the ability to think a complete thought or formulate a complete sentence, getting stuck in thought loops, and experiencing depersonalization. In her phenomenological analysis of solitary confinement, Lisa Gunther writes, quote, "There is a great risk for prisoners in prolonged solitary confinement to get stuck in a moment that goes nowhere, closed into a circular repetition of the same," end quote. Furthermore, solitary confinement can also undermine a subject's capacity to use language or to sequentialize in words. Ulrike Meinhof, the Red Army faction militant who was held in a dead wing, offered this description of solitary, quote, "Sentences, grammar, syntax, no longer controllable. When you've written 2 lines, at the end of the second, you cannot remember how the first one began. A complete inability to communicate. Visits leave no impression. Half an hour later, you can only mechanically reconstruct whether the visit happened today or last week," end quote. In Meinhof's account, the subject who experiences time has collapsed. The distinction between days and weeks no longer holds. In supermax prisons, where inmates are often held in windowless cells and are subjected to artificial light 24 hours a day, prisoners are forcibly detached from their diurnal rhythms and often lose track of the days. While working for an LGBTQ prison abolitionist organization called Black and Pink, prisoners in solitary requested that we include a calendar in our newspaper so that they could have a way of keeping track of the passing of days. Despite the imposition of this brutal carceral temporality, prisoners have developed strategies to control, experience, and mark the passing of time, which are strategies that defend against detemporalization. Gunther writes, quote, "Most prisoners will tell you that in order to do the time rather than having the time do you, one needs to establish a daily schedule," end quote. Thus, time is a terrain of struggle, a field that is constantly negotiated. In a study of how older women in prison negotiate and experience time, Azrini Wahidin and Shirley Tate write, quote, "The women in this study interact with time by making time digestible, ticking off months, weeks, and even days. It was found that the women built their own subjective clock in order to protect themselves from the terror of interminable prison time," end quote. Long-term prisoners may try to ward off the inscription of time on the body by exercising and regulating food intake. If you've ever read the prison memoir by George Jackson, Soledad Brother, he kind of obsessively fixates on his exercise regimen. So 2, mass incarceration sentencing regime. In Dissonance in Time, Unmaking and Remapping of Blackness, Damien M. Sojourner writes, quote, "The annals of late 20th and early 21st century judicial records provide evidence of the imposition of time. The common sense connections between time and incarceration are evident in how time is invoked as a possessive action. Just put your head down and do your time. How much time did I get? Will I get credit for time served? Where do I have to do my time? the application of time as a disciplinary mechanism of power has been key to the corralling of Black freedom, end quote. Not only have sentences gotten longer in the era of mass incarceration, there has been a qualitative shift in how prisoners are allowed to spend their time. The lock 'em up and throw away the key approach in the US that superseded the rehabilitative model is characterized by the imposition of idleness. Yet hard time is not equally distributed. Numerous studies have showed that Black people are given longer sentences than white people, and that even within the Black population, skin tone is correlated to sentence length. A study of skin tone and sentence length among Black women found that, quote, the relationship between skin tone and prison time for Black women were consistent with those of earlier studies focusing on the experiences of Black men. Controlling for several factors, Black women perceived as having lighter skin receive less of a prison sentence and serve less time behind bars, end quote. Thus, the temporality of punishment itself is racialized. Having dark skin increases the distance between the prisoner and the horizon that marks the end of the sentence. Although time is intangible, it becomes directly inscribed on the racialized body. 3, predictive policing and invocations of the future. With the explosion of data science and the increasing deployment of predictive policing software, we are now witnessing a transformation in the temporality of policing. Policing is no longer primarily aimed at effectively responding to crime, but to anticipating and preventing it. This anticipatory element of policing has always been present, but until recently, the judgment of the police officer was considered superior to that of machines. As self-learning AI systems are refined and our faith in machines and predictive analytics increases, we are relinquishing more and more decision-making power to algorithms. What are the chances a parolee will be a recidivist? Where should the police patrol? Whom should the police be monitoring? Increasingly, these decisions are being made algorithmically, sometimes with software that analyzes police data to make such predictions. But predictions are much more about constructing the future through the present management of subjects categorized as threats or risks. Thus, predictions do much more than present us with a probable outcome. They enact the future. The transformation of the temporality of policing with the advent of predictive policing turns the unknowability of the future into a problem that justifies the state's present management through the technical overcoming of uncertainty. In the age of big data, uncertainty is presented as an information problem that can be overcome with comprehensive data collection, statistical analysis that can identify patterns and relationships, and algorithms that can determine future outcomes by analyzing past outcomes. Predictive policing promises to remove the existential terror of not knowing what is going to happen by using data to deliver accurate knowledge about where and when crime will occur. Data installs itself as a solution to the problem of uncertainty by claiming to achieve total awareness and overcome human analytical limitations. Towards the end of 2018, so this is like in November, a few months ago, tech philosopher Nick Bostrom published a working paper titled The Vulnerable World Hypothesis, in which he calls for the creation of a, quote, high-tech panopticon, end quote, consisting of the establishment of global governance and the continuous real-time surveillance of every living person on the planet. Bostrom, best known for his warnings about the dangers of AI in his book Superintelligence, as well as his influence on tech bigwigs such as Elon Musk and Bill Gates, now believes that the risk of apocalypse that accompanies technological development is so high that it warrants turning the planet into a giant prison managed by those who govern. His probabilistic assertions about the inevitability of such an apocalypse are based on a thought experiment. If the urn of creativity, which represents technological development, produces both black and white balls, white represents inventions that benefit humanity, while black represents inventions that can destroy it, it is only a matter of time before we pull a black ball from the urn. So if you've read any of his work, you know that the ethical force of his argument comes from these hypothetical thought experiments. And a very popular thought experiment is this urn of creativity from which you draw balls. Supposed to show that if we think probabilistically about these ethical problems, and we can see that it's only a matter of time before we'll destroy humanity. So as technology develops, the means of mass destruction, such as DIY biohacking, become increasingly accessible, and the likelihood that someone will exercise this destructive potential increases to the point where self-destruction eventually becomes inevitable. According to Bostrom, the only way to militate against such an outcome is to exit the default semi-anarchic conditions by creating a predictive regime of high-tech social control. Quote, everybody is fitted with a freedom tag, a sequent to the more limited wearable surveillance devices familiar today, such as the ankle tag used in several countries as a prison alternative, the body cams worn by many police forces, the pocket trackers and wristbands that some parents use to keep track of their children, and of course, the ubiquitous cell phone. The freedom tag is a slightly more advanced appliance, worn around the neck and bedecked with multi-directional cameras and microphones. Encrypted video and audio is continuously uploaded from the device to the cloud and machine interpreted in real time. AI algorithms classify the activities of the wearer, his hand movements, nearby objects, and other situational cues. If suspicious activity is detected, these are vast office complexes staffed 24/7. There, a freedom officer reviews the video feed on several screens and listens to the audio in headphones. The freedom officer can also dispatch an inspector, a police rapid response unit, or a drone to investigate further. In the small fraction of cases where the wearer refuses to desist from the prescribed activity after repeated warnings, an arrest may be made or other suitable penalties imposed. Citizens are not permitted to remove the freedom tag, except while they are in environments that have been outfitted with adequate external sensors, end quote. By calling the surveillance apparatus a freedom tag, the all-encompassing police state is recast as the ultimate guarantor of humanity's collective freedom. It is hard not to read his phraseology as a self-parody that harkens back to the freedom fries idioms of the Bush era, but Bostrom is sincere in his proposal. He estimates that this ubiquitous system of surveillance would cost only 140 USD per year per person, which would only amount to less than 1% of the world's annual GDP. So it's very funny how he does the cross-benefit analysis here, because he's like, well, cost of civilizational annihilation is way greater than 1% of the world's annual GDP. If there's not enough political will or state capacity to implement such a system, another measure that could be attempted in the absence of a fully universal monitoring system might include, quote, adopting a policy of preemptive incarceration, end quote. Bostrom's freedom tag proposal is hardly surprising when we consider how debates about e-carceration are playing out in the domain of prison reform. Even some prison abolitionists have argued that the use of e-carceration, such as GPS ankle monitoring devices, is a humane alternative to confinement. What Bostrom's proposal represents is merely a generalization of the same preemptive techniques of managing risk. What is unique about Bostrom's proposal is his amplification of the stakes. The preservation of civilization itself depends on the absolute concentration of power and the creation of a unipolar world. Never mind the risks of concentrating the power to surveil the planet in the hands of a global state. The danger in Bostrom's scenario is the plebs. It is hypothetical rogue actors who would have no scruples about wiping out society, extremists, the mentally ill, and antisocial belligerents, not the capitalists and the technocrats who actually control the means of civilizational annihilation. In the high-tech panopticon, deviance itself must be neutralized. For anyone who does not possess a normative identity, worldview, or temperament is a potential threat insofar as they might not be invested in the preservation of the society that excludes them. The predictive regime has as its ultimate aim the elimination of difference, for otherness is seen as inherently risky. But paranoia feeds on itself. It is self-fulfilling. Eventually, paranoia can attach itself to almost any object and poison every area of social life. In the vulnerable world imagined by Bostrom, every living, breathing person on the planet is a potential risk. Paranoia is the underside of power, and power is self-preserving. With technological development comes the consolidation of power, but also, or so the paranoid tech ethicists claim, the multiplication of risks and vulnerabilities. Thus, doomsayers like Bostrom have constructed a teleological view of technology that serves as the justification for techno-fascism. Left unchecked, this ideology would justify turning the world into a prison. 4, time maroons, and other temporal renegades. Damien M. Sojourner writes, quote, "Black radical time is not something that is employed to be inflicted upon people," end quote. In the post-industrial, post-apocalyptic urban cityscape of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a collective of Black artists, writers, and musicians are dreaming up new temporal modes and practices of being in the world that draw from quantum physics, African cosmologies, Afrofuturism, and the Black radical tradition. The Black Quantum Futurism Collective, or BQF, was founded by lawyer and sci-fi writer Rashida Phillips and musician and poet Moormother. And you might have seen BQF perform last year at this festival. The collective engages in community memory work that brings people together to unearth and document lost histories of Black Philadelphia neighborhoods that are in the process of being gentrified. The goal of BQF is to develop, quote, "a new approach to living and experiencing reality by way of the manipulation of space-time in order to see into possible futures and/or collapse space-time into a desired future in order to bring about that future's reality," end quote. To give you a sense of their work, and hopefully you've seen them before because they're incredible, here is a video of Moormother performing live. Thank you. So I first encountered BQF when I saw Moormother perform at a queer dance party fundraiser event in Philly. During an event, Moormother performed a hybrid set consisting of spoken word and shrieking over loud, ominous electronic sounds. The lyrics revolved around the themes of grief, anger, premature death, anti-Black violence, and ghosts. What Moormother was doing was a kind of time sorcery that sought to bring the past in contact with the present and future, to merge them through sounds that sought to, quote, "sing the graves open," end quote. Embedded in BQF's aesthetic and political practice is a critique of Western notions of time that conceptualize of time as linear and organized around the discrete categories of past, present, and future. For BQF, contemporary notions of time are intimately tied to the entwined histories of capitalism and slavery. When describing a BQF Community Futures Lab workshop, Art in America critic Michael McCann writes, quote, "Phillips detailed how European Judeo-Christian traditions experience time as an inevitable flow towards a divinely ordained future. She continued to explain how capitalism incorporated this future-oriented linearity into labor and production as it began to regulate time more precisely through mechanical clocks, calendars, and bells. This was assimilated into slavery in the Americas as masters moved from nature-based timekeeping to mechanical clock time, Slave owners wrote books detailing how many hours a slave should work to achieve the most profit and how to maximize efficiency using clock-based schedules enforced by physical punishments. With emancipation, slavery came to an end, but the powerful rhythms and logic of mechanical time remained. End quote. To counter the rigid temporalities that originated in capitalism and slavery, BQF has created a practice of time marronage, where the rules of clock time are subverted by practices that imaginatively summon ancestors, conjure ghosts, project practitioners into the future, and amalgamate the past, present, and future in order to create new political openings. These time renegades demonstrate that becoming ungovernable by resisting the imposition of violent temporalities is a cornerstone of Black freedom. 5, the politics of dreaming. Everywhere I look, I see sleepwalkers under the spell of the prison and the imposition of carceral time. The prison is a problem for thought that can only be unthought, using a mode of thinking that does not capitulate to the realism of the present. What counterspells are powerful enough to break the prison stranglehold on our imaginations? But the spell is never total. The intensification of the desire for life undermines the prison's capacity to structure our mental lives. Imagination is always in excess. It is that which could never be contained by the prison, that which will always exceed it. What night endeavors must we embrace to enter that hidden frequency, that special vibration, the one Sun Ra believed would set us free? When dream becomes a hammer we summon to shatter the realism of the prison. Assata Shakur, a Black revolutionary who lives in exile in Cuba, writes, quote, "Dream and reality are opposites. Action synthesizes them," end quote. Before Assata was liberated from prison, her grandmother and family came to visit her bearing a dream. "You're coming home soon," her grandmother said. "I don't know when it will be, but you're coming home. You're getting out of here. It won't be too long, though." She went on, "I dreamed we were in our old house in Jamaica. I was dressing you, putting your clothes on." Assata's grandmother was known for her prophetic dreams. They came when they were needed, but it was ultimately the responsibility of the recipients of the visions to make them real, not only by believing in their veracity, but by acting so as to give the prophecies flesh. When Assata returned to her prison cell, she could not help but dance and sing. She writes, "No amount of scientific, rational thinking could diminish the high that I felt. A tingly, giddy excitement had caught hold of me. I got drunk on my family's arrogant, carefree optimism. I literally danced in my cell, singing, 'Feet don't fail me now.' I sang the feet part real low, so I guess the guards must have thought I was bugging out, stomping around my cage, singing, 'Feet, feet.' when we act in accordance with the prophetic dream, the dream comes to directly constitute reality. 6, the rhythm of revolt. Sometimes I don't know how to end or what to tell you. For some time I have been thinking about how to convey the message of police and prison abolition, but I know that as a poet, it is not my job to win you over with a persuasive argument, but to impart to you a vibrational experience that is capable of awakening your desire for another world. A few years ago, I saw the Black Arts Movement poet and activist Sonia Sanchez speak. I was moved by the way she paused whenever she experienced vertigo and spontaneously started singing as a way to find her rhythm after nearly passing out. In a haiku, Sonia writes, "Without your residential breath, I lose my timing." Our bodies are not closed loops. We hold each other and keep each other in time by marching, singing, embracing, breathing. We synchronize our tempos so we can find a rhythm through which the urge to live can be expressed collectively. And in this way, we set the world in motion. In this way, poets become the timekeepers of the revolution. 7, planting the dream. In Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, Robin D.G. Kelley writes, quote, "What shall we build on the ashes of a nightmare? I won't propose much more, since the design and realization of such a space ought to be the product of a collective imagination shaped and reshaped by the very process of turning rubble and memory into the seeds of a new society." End quote. I see our shadow in the trees, watching the wheel unfold. I see our one shadow on the wall. I see your restless hand in the spider's thread. I am the ice cave, and there is water, deep blue and white, a light at the bottom. I am equal to my love for you. Let down your hair, willow in the moonlight. The river lulls us into the dream. Nightmares jostle branches in our eyes. I long for the world that is before you, the plate you set on the slate of tomorrow. Your fingers flutter to feel for the grass between the valleys, where one foot follows the other into the flaming creek. We don't know what name to give the throbbing stone perched atop the hill. From here, I see for you. Look at what I lost when you were lost, and I could only hear the call of the stones. A body returned, floats down the river dressed in candles. I send you the secret while you are asleep. The nights you carried in the length of a strand of hair, the unforgiving flash of his teeth. I stroke your cheek to unlock your jaw and release the rose you carry in your mouth. Your tongue is raw, and your mouth is filling with blood. Dear, dear, forgive us for having fallen so far from where you planted the seed, at the bottom of the sea, waiting for the body to ride the stream back to where the rubble gave birth to the first dream. The egg cracks, night wanders seaward, barefoot in her evening slip. And by this sadness you are shown the path to the holding sea, a trail burned by a herd of somnambulant turtles who folded one by one in their grief until a single remained to carry the breath of time back to the seed. Thank you.
That was really lovely. Thank you. We're going to have a possibility of questions on both sides. I've been told we have 15 to 20 minutes for this Q&A. There's so many questions that come to mind now, and just wanting to mention things you haven't even mentioned that are also in the book.
Yep.
There's a whole political economy, an explanation of theories of capitalism, which you add your own further points to, especially because you have this very important and specific case of carceral time and capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll keep it to 2 questions.
Okay.
Let's take the capitalism question, because
Okay.
we can work with that and add that to the many layers you already have, and then I'll let you choose between a question on technology, artistic practice, or a comparison to the EU.
Great. Oh, capitalism.
Yeah.
What a big topic. Can of worms you opened there. So yes, my book has a lot of political economy, and so I include the poetic and creative parts to kind of ventilate the text, because there's a lot of very dry technical stuff about political economy in the book. But I was writing primarily about particular practices that happen in the US but aren't limited to the US. So my point of departure for thinking about the political economy of policing in particular is the case of Ferguson. So Ferguson, Missouri is a city that was in the global spotlight when Michael Brown was killed by a police officer, and there were riots and protests that happened after his death and the acquittal of Officer Darren Wilson. And so what happened basically in the US was that the Department of Justice decided to do an investigation of the Ferguson Police Department to try to neutralize the protesters. And what they found was that the city was using the courts and the police to generate revenue for the municipality. So basically what was happening was the financial manager of the city was in direct correspondence with the police chief, telling him how much money he needed to raise to fill revenue shortfalls for that year. And so what you saw happen was the police ramped up their ticketing, and they created all of these schemes to ensnare people in debt. So in Ferguson, there were 3 arrest warrants per household. That's how rampant this practice was. And subsequent research has revealed that this was not something that was particular to Ferguson in the US. It's happening across the country in predominantly Black municipalities. And it's usually in places that are experiencing like deindustrialization. So there's a lot of economic pressure placed on the cities because there's things like white flight, so the collapse of the tax base as well. But what I really wanted to do was kind of think about what was happening locally in a kind of global context. So what I found was happening was there's a creation of new kinds of financial instruments that government bodies, and not only in the US, can use as a way to issue debt when they don't have enough money to fund their operations. And so some of these instruments basically amount to making bets about interest rates with public money. So what you saw happen in the lead up to the Detroit bankruptcy was they did these swap agreements where the city had to pay the banks if interest rates went down. So the city was betting on interest rates rising because it was a bull market. And then when interest rates collapsed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, they ended up owing tons of money to the banks just for these swap agreements, not even considering that they need to fund their pension fund, for example. So the ideology was around the 2008 financial crash was like, oh, poor people were irresponsible and they didn't, borrow wisely. They should have known these subprime mortgages were not good loans, et cetera. And it was a similar narrative with the municipal fiscal crisis in Detroit, or the narrative was that, oh, they're reckless with their borrowing and their government spending, and kind of ignoring the role of the investor class in making all of these things happen and setting it up the way that it is. So I really wanted to think about the relationship between the state and capitalism. So there has been some theorization around this question, and the state is usually conceptualized as like a shock absorber and not necessarily this kind of agent that facilitates racialized predatory extraction. The idea is that usually the state is subsidizing industry, Walmart and Amazon, they get all these government subsidies and that's taxpayer dollars. But actually we see the state directly engaging in modes of extraction and then transferring the money that they're extracting to the financial class. So that's like a very, very long answer to your question about capitalism. So my book is kind of extending the analytic of racial capitalism to think about the debt economy and prisons and police in particular.
Yeah, I really find it very helpful, your presentation of the state as we're moving into a kind of predatory state and predatory capitalism, whether one's speaking of the specific example of carceral capitalism, but also just debt and the kind of hostile capturing of people's futures through those mechanisms. So it's really, I really recommend these, what you call dry chapters, which I think is not how I've experienced them. we have a person over here, so I was just going to let you choose. Shall we talk just briefly about, would you like to, can I ask you a question about technology, or would you want to have a question about artistic practice?
Are there people with questions?
Yeah. I think we have one here.
Okay.
Yeah, sure, I'll go ahead then.
Okay, then we go back to the technology and art.
Thank you so much for a really stimulating, but also a really evocative and really beautiful talk. I was thoroughly enjoying it. I have two questions. I'll try to be brief. My first is on whether you consider the ways that carceral temporality might not just be indexed specifically to the location of the prison as an institution, but the way that there's a kind of a mechanism of social contagion that happens, for example, with the prison guards that work at these institutions, and the way that the rhythms of carceral temporality also entrap them in their logics. And also speaking from your personal experience, perhaps, with respect to your brother, the ways that family networks or close friends of people who are incarcerated also become wrapped up in these rhythms of carceral temporality. So that's my first question. My second question is just to ask if you could elaborate a bit further on the debt model of time, and if you do any thinking along the lines of kind of hedge funds and betting speculatively for or against certain kinds of financial outcomes based on those debts.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, the chapter in my book, well, it's actually like a section that is attached at the end of the chapter on juvenile delinquency and biopower. It's called Ripples in Time, so it's specifically thinking not only of the way that the time of the person who is incarcerated is structured, but also the ripple effect of incarceration. And so I'm kind of looking at it from the perspective of having an incarcerated sibling. So it was, very much the case that my own rhythm was structured by my brother's situation. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, my brother had a resentencing hearing. This was 2 years ago. And this hearing was continually deferred. So I would have to fly to Florida because I was going to testify as a character witness, and then it would be canceled at the last minute. And we were told that the prosecutor was going to offer a plea deal, and it wouldn't go to the hearing, but it never arrived. And so I was kind of waiting around okay, should I buy my ticket? Should I cancel my ticket? What's happening? So there was a way in which the rhythm of the court hearings created this tempo of anxiety. So there was this anticipation of this very high stakes event happening, and then it would be canceled, and there was a deflation of expectations and whatever, and then it would start all over again. And meanwhile, I'm a grad student trying to teach and living with this kind of uncertainty hanging above everything. So I was also trying to think of the ways in which juridical limbo is a carceral temporality. And you can imagine, what it might be like to be on, say, death row when you have a similar situation where there's an appeal for clemency, and an execution might be stopped at the last minute, and then it starts all over again. So I do think that rhythm is a form of torture as well. And then what was the second question again? Debt time, yeah, great question. And speculation, too. I mean, I think about this a lot when I think about the experience of being in debt. It's basically compulsory in the U.S. that you take out student loans, and the cost of tuition everywhere in the world has been going up. I think in Germany, you probably only pay a little bit of money for your bus pass or something, but that's not the case in the U.S. So I always think about, what happens to someone who's ensnared in this debt in terms of what decisions they can make about their future. So now I follow the business press, and there are all these articles about how paying down debt is now the new job benefit because millennials can't think of planning for retirement because they haven't bought themselves out of debt yet. So there's a way in which your ability to even look or imagine your future is structured by being in debt. So when you're constantly trying to just get out of the hole, you can't really plan for your future. You're too busy paying off the past. So I think about that a lot, and the weird monetization of the future with financial speculation. So I recently wrote an article about the conceptual artist Cameron Rowland, who did a Whitney museum piece where he had the museum invest in a social impact bond as like a commentary on the, financialization of, prisoners themselves. So what you see happening with this new financial instrument is it's literally creating a way for investors to make a bet about a social outcome. And so in the case with prisoner social impact bonds, the bet is about recidivism rates. So the idea is that, well, if you incentivize the financial sector to reduce recidivism, then you're drawing on the power of the market and market efficiency to shape social outcomes. But really, at the end of the day, what's happening with these speculative instruments is it's literally the financial sector making a bet on a social outcome.
Did we have someone waiting to ask a question? Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for that awesome talk. I guess this question really is sort of about form and method. One of the things that I think is so important about what you're doing is this sort of re-rhythming of ordinary life, right? This idea that this re-rhythming is not just diagnosis or prescription, but as you quote others, sort of planting these seeds of dreams. Can you talk a little bit about even just the way that you've collected these ideas and maybe a little bit more about your method?
Yeah. I'm very associative in my method. I read very, very widely, very scattershot with the books that I select in my reading life. So I'm always constellating things and putting them next to each other to see how they vibrate next to each other, what kinds of interesting tensions are produced. For example, there's a part that I didn't read tonight in the conclusion of my book where I juxtapose some quotes from the film Nostalgia for the Light. And the quote was about Chilean political prisoners under the Pinochet regime who did astronomy lessons while they were in prison, and the quote was about the prison taking those astronomy lessons away because they were afraid of the prisoners using that knowledge to escape and navigate using the stars. And then after watching this film, I was reading Heather Ann Thompson's History of the Attica Uprising. And there's a moment in the book where she describes the first night of the uprising. And there was an older prisoner who hadn't seen the stars in 22 years, so he was like weeping while looking at the stars. I just thought that was it was a very compelling juxtaposition for me to put these two moments next to each other, particularly of prisoners looking at the stars and contemplating their kind of place in the cosmic order, and also thinking about how these events were in geographically distant places, but they're only a few years apart, and they're looking at the same stars as well. So part of my practice is just like reading very widely, gathering, and just kind of intuitively sensing where things should go and what things resonate with each other.
Yeah, maybe we just end. I think we have to keep on time. I'm not sure how much time we have left. I'll let Christopher just come on stage and tell us to stop. But you showed us More Mother, the Black Quantum Futurism Collective, and thinking about artistic practice, machines, music, Sun Ra, you mentioned also. And just kind of following on, I think, some of the point that the previous question, the questioner before this last question was talking about, that these things, these technologies, you say in the book, as technologies of control are perfected, carcerality will bleed into society. Mm-hmm. So it spreads. But I think we can also emphasize the reverse of that, mm-hmm. which is, I mean, I was taking the train from Sweden to Berlin, remember sitting on a train thinking of going to the home of techno, Detroit techno, because you're writing in the book about examples from Detroit. And these things also bleed, these things with machines and feelings, mm-hmm. and rhythms, what you call collective rhythms, also kind of can bleed and vibrate back and forth across countries and oceans. Do you want to say anything more about rhythmic revolt, as I think you said?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I always think of, Sun Ra, space is the place where he lands on the planet, and he's like, this place has a different vibration. He can, like, sense it. And you can feel it when there's a new rhythm being created in the atmosphere, and you're tuned into it, and other people around you are tuned into it, and I think that there's, incredible potential in that kind of vibrational, rhythmic experience. So, as I joked earlier, I really do think that that is the method that I'm trying to use in the conclusion of my book, rather than just, using poetry to do something, to think about the prison abolitionist imagination, to think about vibrational experiences. And yeah, that's, and Sonia Sanchez too, is just seeing her and her way of going in and out of different rhythms really clarified that for me too.
Here comes Christopher.
We have some Afrofuturist rhythms coming up here later tonight. And that's why some, Carceral Temporalities impose themselves on us, so that I will have to actually thank you both so much for this fantastic lecture and moderation. And unfortunately, I think we'll have to close here. Thank you.